Welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri Few, US PI's weekly podcast that empowers parents to reclaim their children's education from government bureaucrats and social engineers. In each episode, Sheri delivers the latest news from the front lines of the fight for the minds of the next generation, equipping you with the tools and resources needed to join the cause.
Hi everyone, welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri Few. I'm your host, Sheri Few, and I have another powerful episode for you today. Joining me is Neeraja Deshpande, Policy Analyst and Engagement Coordinator at the Independent Women's Forum. She's also a fellow at Stand Together and has previously worked with the Free Press and taught middle and high school math, English, and financial literacy. Neeraja is the author of a recent report titled Give Teachers a Break: Cutting Red Tape to Unleash the Potential of America's Great Teachers, and a compelling article called For Better Schools: Ditch the Department of Education. We like that. So we'll talk about all of that and what's really holding back teachers and why federal overreach is damaging our education system, and how returning to local control could be the key to saving American education. Before we dive in, please take a moment to give us a 5-star rating or a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe and share the show. You can also visit uspie.org to learn more and to join the movement.
Today's episode is brought to you by U.S. parents involved in education. U.S. PI's mission is to empower parents and local communities to break free from federal and national influences, thereby reclaiming parental authority over their children's education. For more insights from U.S. parents involved in education, connect with us at US PI on X and Facebook. To join the movement, visit uspie.org.
Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri Few. Joining me now is Neeraja Deshpande from the Independent Women's Forum. Neeraja, it's great to have you with us. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to be here.
Absolutely. So glad you could make it. So let's start by having you tell us a little bit about your work with the Independent Women's Forum.
Yeah, so I work on education policy, and as you noted, I just wrote a report recently called Give Teachers a Break. So the basic idea behind that report is partially informed by my own experiences as a teacher, which were that, teaching is just such a rewarding job. There is nothing else like it in so many ways. But currently, as the system stands in America right now, the entire profession is just bogged down by bureaucracy. And so I was thinking about which sorts of policies are getting in the way of teachers, which sorts of, red tape are holding teachers back, and, what changes can we make to eliminating bureaucracy and helping teachers succeed in their own classrooms? Because while there are problems often with teachers, right? While there's often an issue where, like we've seen like libs of TikTok, right? We think about teachers who are just, ideologically poisoned. They're teaching politics in the classroom. They're not teaching properly. Those people do exist, but they're not everyone. And so we should, while we should obviously address the bad teachers in the room, we should also make it clear that there's a lot of really, really good teachers who also don't want any part of that, who just really want to be able to do their jobs and who are sort of incapable, not incapable of doing it, but they're made incapable of doing it by bad policies.
Well, that makes a lot of sense to me, and I'm really glad that you wrote this report. When it came across my desk, I was very intrigued because this is not a topic we usually broach. We're always pointing at the problems, and you and I both agree on many of the problems in government schools today. And I believe, we hear a lot of talk about teacher retention, and it's my opinion that the good teachers are leaving the profession because there is so much to deal with. There's things that they don't want to be teaching children. So I'm really interested in hearing more about your report. So in the report, you highlight how red tape and bureaucracy are driving good teachers out of the profession. So for those who haven't read your report yet, can you talk about the kinds of regulations teachers are up against and how that impacts learning in the classroom?
I'll start with the biggest one, right? So you mentioned teacher retention, which is such a huge issue, right? You have these teachers leaving in droves, and you're right, it is the best teachers who are leaving, right? It is often people who really, really love the job and who just feel they can't ethically do it anymore, or they can't subject themselves to that constant abuse anymore. So whatever it is, they just feel the need to leave. Um, but one of the biggest reasons that teachers are actually the biggest reason teachers are leaving the profession per various studies at this point is student behavior, right? So student behavior has really deteriorated. And so when you say that sort of thing, you might wonder, okay, so why aren't teachers controlling that behavior, right? That's like the next obvious question. And that's a good question. The problem is the government has in many cases stopped them from being able to do anything. So that sort of trend started in the Obama administration. So under the guise of progressivism and inclusion and diversity and whatnot, the Department of Education under Obama basically made it impossible in 2014 to suspend or expel students, to give these traditional punishments to students, and that was to supposedly reduce racial inequities or something. But what they did was they made it almost impossible for schools to give out the number of expulsions and detentions and suspensions that they otherwise would have given out, and that really led to a lot of bad behavior. And it turned out that the Obama administration policies were modeled on the policies that led to the Parkland shooting. And that shooting happened in 2018 at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, in Parkland, Florida. And what ended up happening was that then Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, revoked those regulations. But unfortunately, by this point, a lot of states had already sort of codified that Department of Education guidance in their own state laws, right? And a lot of localities had. And everyone was saying this is progressivism, this is inclusion, this is tolerance, and ultimately what that did was it killed student behavior that tanked further during COVID and school closures, right? And what's wound up happening because of that is that you have teachers who are dealt with this impossible situation, which is that they have classrooms of 30, sometimes 40 kids, and they're just literally not allowed to do anything to discipline them. So, going back to sane regulations on student discipline, right? Making sure that states aren't arbitrarily getting in the way of disciplining, of schools being able to discipline their students. That is going to be a huge that is going to lead to potentially a huge change in teacher retention and allow teachers to actually do their jobs and control the classrooms and make sure that students are disciplined enough to be able to learn. So that's just one example, but there's so many other examples, right? There are state policies that make it almost impossible to fail students, right? So that's a different sort of discipline, right? Maybe it's not physical violence or it's not, outright misbehavior, but it's kids just sort of slacking off and still passing, and the teachers are kind of forced to pass them. So again, like these sorts of regulations that get in the way of having any standards for academics or for behavior, they wind up making teaching a worse profession, and it makes teachers leave, and it impoverishes students from learning.
Well, I certainly appreciate the way you framed that. And, I've talked to some teachers here locally in the state where I live in South Carolina. In fact, I'm going to be interviewing one soon about her experiences in her local school. And she's very concerned about safety. They actually had a student, there was a shooting recently. And so she has some ideas that she's going to share with us on those lines as well. But you're absolutely right. And I know I'm familiar with the Obama guidance that, basically just strip discipline in schools. But I have to tell you, from my generation, I'm a generation before you, at least one or two, and we've seen change over time with discipline that's been a problem. I come from the old school where we had corporal punishment. And so over time, it just became a bad thing to discipline children at all. And then, of course, there's the equity things where they want everybody to have the same treatment. So you can't discipline certain races and that kind of thing. So you're absolutely right. You've hit the nail on the head there. And so, can you describe some of the ways that this failure shows up in everyday classrooms, especially when it comes to discipline and academic expectations?
It really depends on, what sort of school you're in. So you'll talk with teachers who are, teaching in inner cities, and I've taught in inner cities myself, but I mean, you'll talk with those teachers and they're subjected to, I mean, often physical violence, right? There'll be kids bringing weapons to school. There will be kids throwing desks at them. They have almost no protection against the kids, right? Even if they're being physically violent, the teachers just literally are sort of the victims there sometimes. And it makes it again into a problem for retention. When you sort of go away from that though, I mean, you have teachers in sort of, districts where there aren't maybe as many physically violent threats, but there are other problems, right? Kids talking back, they can't do anything about that, right? There's, all these trends in the culture like gentle parenting, right? Where kids even at home, they're not really having any discipline. And so what ends up happening is that the teacher is often the first person, the first adult in this kid's life to say no to the kid, right? And that makes the kid act out. And you multiply that by 30, and that's another thing I think teachers, especially in wealthier districts, sometimes face, and you can hear that when you talk to them, that even if they're not having death thrown at them, even if they're not being threatened with weapons, they're still sort of they're still incapacitated sometimes from being able to deal with those real behavioral challenges. And then for academic standards, I mean, that's kind of again across the board, where you see, I mean, I was pleasantly surprised, where Representative Ro Khanna, so he's a Democrat from California, and he's in the Palo Alto school district. So he's a far leftist. I don't, I'm not a big fan of Ro Khanna, but one thing I was pleasantly surprised to see was that he was tweeting that in Palo Alto public schools, they had gotten rid of, I think, honors math. And he said, this is ridiculous, and I was just in Palo Alto like 2 weeks ago. It is a very wealthy place, right? It is not some like low grade, like school. These are people who can afford nice homes, and it's a beautiful area. And they're getting rid of honors math because, again, equity, inclusion, tolerance, all these sorts of incredibly misguided ideas. So you'll see wealthy schools often throwing out standards in that sense because, everyone gets an A. It's participation trophy culture. And again, then you go to the lower end of the economic spectrum, and it's kids literally who won't be showing up for hundreds of days of the school year, right? Like there is 180 days and they won't show up for 120 days, and they'll still somehow pass. So when that sort of thing happens, it's often school policy. It is not necessarily that the teachers want to pass those kids, right? The teachers are also sort of horrified at the fact that the kids can get away with so much. But the teachers, at the same time, like if the state is saying, well, we're going to take funding away from you, right? If this number of kids doesn't pass, well, it's like you're putting them in an impossible situation. So we've really put these teachers in an impossible position, and it's not something that we should be doing if we want, I don't know, an educated citizenry and a functional school system, which I think all Americans should want.
Amen. I agree with that. So you reminded me of when my nephew was graduating high school in North Carolina. That was probably 15 years ago. When I went to his graduation, I was surprised to learn that they didn't have a valedictorian. And it was explained to me that that was a new trend, because they don't want to make any student feel less important than another. So they eliminated even, programs that would reward, academic achievement. So just really sad, the trend that we've been on for some time now in trying to have all the outcomes for children be the same. And, we can't have outcomes be the same if the input is not the same. It just is common sense, and I'm sure you understand that. So I need to take a short break right now, but when we come back, I want to dig into your article about the Department of Education and what real decentralization could look like. Don't go away. We'll be right back with more from Neeraja Deshpande. Who would have ever thought serious adults would be unable to answer, what is a woman? Title IX, written to protect girls, has morphed into a tool to shield boys pretending to be girls, putting girls at a disadvantage in sports and at risk in locker rooms. After the sexual revolution of the 60s, young women were taught to discard motherhood in favor of a career. Act more like men, they were told. Today, they're encouraged to become men through drugs and irreversible surgeries. In 2018, Dr. Lisa Lippman conducted a study on the rise of rapid onset gender dysphoria, mostly among females, a complex change of cultural norms, and warned that caution is warranted. Caution? U.S. Parents Involved Education believes it's time to act to save our girls. Tune in next week for more insights from U.S. Parents Involved in Education and connect with us at USPI on X and Facebook. To join the movement, visit uspi.org. Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri Few. I'm speaking with Neeraja Deshpande from the Independent Women's Forum. Neeraja, your article lays out a strong case for dismantling the U.S. Department of Education. Not to harm education, but to save it. For those who may not understand the constitutional argument, can you explain why the federal government was never intended to play such a central role in education?
Yeah, absolutely. So you look at the Constitution, right? You look at Article 1, Section 8, and that's the part of the Constitution that outlines what the federal government has authority over. And there's no mention of education whatsoever, right? So you think about the fact that the founders never intended for the federal government to play such a big role in education or really any role at all. But, you look at that fact and it's like, well, of course, the system is a mess, right? We've just created a system that was never meant to exist to begin with. That was never that's so bloated, that's so centralized, and it really goes against the spirit of decentralization. That's I think really that's something Americans really, really care about, the spirit of federalism and also just the Constitution, right? And it was only really under Jimmy Carter, which is pretty recently, 1979, that the Department of Education became a thing. So we had been, we got to the moon before there was a Department of Education. We figured out the Manhattan Project before there was a Department of Education. So it's not clear to me that we need a Department of Education for actually having decent, well-run schools. And in fact, I mean, I think the track record of the past, 45 years of its history has not necessarily been the best one. And even away from theory, away from the constitutionality of it all, in practice, we just don't seem to have gotten anything for it. So we should really consider what decentralization means and how localities can best deal with their schools, basically, instead of letting bureaucrats in DC tell them what to do.
Absolutely. And, of course, we agree with that here at United States Parents Involved in Education. It's actually our mission to close the Department of Education. It's been our mission for 10 years now. And not only closing the Department of Ed, but also ending all federal education mandates because there are many other agencies and federal laws that influence education in this country. And so we believe that once we restore parental and local control, we're going to have a much better product as far as the education we're providing to children in this country. So you shine a light on how federal funding is being misused in your report to push harmful ideological agendas in our schools, things like racial gender theory, race-based programming. So what are some of the more troubling examples of this, and how do you think that kind of influence has crept into so many classrooms?
I think you look at a lot of this. I mean, what the Trump administration is doing is great, first of all, right? Because what they're saying is get all this stuff out of the classroom. That is so important. And I think, especially when it comes to things like race based programming, race based preferences that have basically violated pre existing civil rights for law, right? That's a huge problem where these schools and colleges were always in violation of civil rights laws, right? When they were giving preferential treatment to one race over the other. There was never that was never part of our civil rights law. There was no, there should not have ever been any sort of anti-white discrimination, right? That was not the point of civil rights to discriminate against white people, but that's what a lot of schools and colleges did. And the Trump administration is now going after them for having done that. And again, that's a sort of thing where it's like, okay, we're sort of moving away from that, right? Like the colleges and the schools are now realizing, oh, this was illegal and we can't keep doing this or we're going to lose our funding. And
Mhm.
that's I think that's so important. I think ultimately they've shown that they respond to power, and the fact that the federal government is appropriately using its power to crack down on this is really important. But you look at these broader things, these ideas of race and gender and critical blah 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 theory, and I'll say, a lot of it isn't just federal directives, right? And that's the really important thing, because insofar as it is, the federal government can just crack down on this stuff, it's going to, and that's great. But there's sort of more small, insidious stuff happening at the local level that I think is, I mean, it changes from place to place, right? I'm in Massachusetts, so you can imagine what Massachusetts is like. It hopefully is different in South Carolina, but yeah, I mean, in Massachusetts, you're going to see way more of this stuff organically accepted by people, right? So I think part of it is that, when we say decentralize the federal government's role in education, that does mean that once that's actually decentralized, and once that's actually happening, parents kind of also need to take that sort of active role, because otherwise it's not just federal, right? If it were just federal, that would be one thing that would be actually easier. But it's harder. It's harder because there is organic buy-in among many people. There are lots of crazy radical activists in schools. That is a real issue, and there are also, I mean, just yeah, these ideologies are in textbooks, they're in the assigned curriculum, they're all over the place. So it's not, and it's not necessarily the most obvious places. So I think that's just one really important thing to keep in mind for parents, for sane teachers, for sane administrators, for policymakers, that this is a matter of policy, yes, but it's also a matter of culture, and that culture, especially at the local level, really matters.
Well, that's very insightful, and you're absolutely right, because even with the work that President Trump's administration is doing, with his executive orders, we all know, of course, executive orders are only as good as long as that president's in office, and it can be just turned around completely with another administration. And so, and then fundamentally, it is about, when you restore local control, it is about parents being involved, because, I like to tell people that government closest to the people governs best. And people are going to be far more effective in influencing their local school board or even their state legislature than they are the federal government. So eliminating the feds first is a necessary step. But there will still be issues, especially in some states. Some states will not do it well. But if the Congress gets behind the president in some of his policies and implements laws that will protect children in these states, I think that could also be very helpful. And we actually see some legislation coming to fruition like that. So you're absolutely right. Very insightful. Um, so, from your experience, both in the classroom and now in policy, what would it look like to actually empower teachers and improve education by removing the top down mandates from Washington?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the top-down mandates from Washington, a lot of these, one nice thing is that the Trump administration has really, I mean, gotten rid of a lot of those things, and has, cracked down on unsafe schools. They've cracked down on student behavior. Those are two of the really, really big ones that were coming federally. But there are other issues too, right? And a lot of them are at the state level. So they're bigger than the local level. They're smaller than the federal level. So you look at a lot of these state level policies. You look at, for instance, the teacher licensure system, right? So that's kind of a bureaucratic mess. What's happened essentially with the teacher licensure system is that you think about all these crazy colleges and universities, right? And you think about the craziest, if you take, Harvard, for instance, right, that's in the news right now. The craziest school is going to be the School of Education, right, within Harvard. There's the medical school, there's a law school. I mean, those are going to be fine. But the School of Education, that's going to be where the really crazy ideologues are. So when you have those crazy ideologues who are teaching new teachers, right, and they're not just teaching new teachers, they're also creating new professors, and those professors, somebody who's trained at Harvard University might go to teach at the University of Oklahoma, right? So that person is now teaching teachers at the University of Oklahoma those same bad ideas they learned at Harvard. So that's how this entire these ideologies, that's how they spread, right? If we're so concerned about ideology in the classroom, we're so concerned about decentralization, which we should be, right? One really big thing that we can do to achieve that decentralization is to sort of break through that teacher licensure process, because you know what also ends up happening is that talented teachers, like, or talented potential teachers in various states, are just unable to teach because they're subjected to this incredibly bureaucratic process. So if you can reform the process, right? If you can do what states like Florida have done, right? So states like Florida have made it easier for people who are, say, a little bit older, who have some work experience, to get licensure, to sort of circumvent the original process, like the standard process. That's potentially like that's a huge benefit, right? And I mean, what Florida also has done is it's cracked down on the 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 schools of education, like the universities that teach new teachers, right? So it's made it impossible for those schools to teach these really divisive ideologies. They've said we won't give licensure granting powers to universities that train teachers in the way that is not in accordance with our values. So again, states can use their power to do this, right? States can really attract sane, decent people to the profession, because I think another thing that's been happening is that people who, people who think to themselves, I don't want to trans kids, right? I don't want to be in a position where I have to, affirm a child's pronouns, right? Something like that. Or I don't want to be in a position where I'm teaching these divisive racial ideologies. And I also felt that myself. That's part of why I left, because I realized if I stayed longer in the profession, and if I, went to a different school and whatnot, I would just be forced to be a mouthpiece for things that I really did not believe in. So what ends up happening is that, you deter people who feel that way. And so I think it's on red states. I think it's on, I mean, blue states ideally too, but we can start with red states. It's on red states to bring those people, to attract those people, to say, okay, we get that the teaching profession has fallen off the rails, and that a lot of teachers have gone crazy, that there have been ideologues in education, but we want you non-ideologues too. We want good people, and we want to retain good people.
Well, yes, and so and I think they're being forced to do that, don't you? Because of the teacher shortage all over the country. I mean, even in red states like South Carolina, where I live, there's serious teacher shortages. So they're having to adjust their policies and look at their certification process and allow new ideas, because otherwise they're not going to have the teachers they need to fulfill their academic needs. So we're going to take one more short break, but when we come back, I'm going to ask you the two questions that I ask all my guests before we close the show. Stay with us. We'll be right back. School choice is becoming popular, with new laws passing in many states. U.S. Parents Involved in Education's mission is to empower parents, helping them to break free from government influence in education. This is why we oppose government-sponsored school choice. Parents already have real choices, with public, private, and homeschool options in every state. The new Money Follow the Child model redistributes tax dollars to parents for private and home schools, but this funding model allows the government to impose regulations, eliminating education freedom. The U.S. Department of Education sued Hillsdale College for noncompliance with federal regulations, and the court ruled that the government can indeed regulate what it pays for. Tune in next week for more insights from U.S. Parents Involved in Education, and connect with us at USPI on X and Facebook. To join the movement, visit uspie.org. Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri Few. I'm here with Neeraja Deshpande from the Independent Women's Forum. Neeraja, thank you so much for this important conversation. Before we let you go, I want to ask you two questions we ask all our guests. First, what are some of your biggest concerns about the future of education in America? And second, what gives you hope?
One of my biggest concerns is actually just that people aren't reading in general in America right now. reading, I think, has been one of those things that's completely fallen off a cliff, and people's attention spans have decreased. And so what's happened is that that's also affected children. So one of my biggest concerns actually isn't really even ideological in that nature. It's sort of just I'm concerned about the dumbing down of America, and I'm concerned that schools are also being dumbed down in that bigger process. So even as we get rid of ideology in schools, I really truly believe that it's on its way out. I do believe the tide has turned on that. Obviously, there's still work to be done, and in blue states like mine, it's going to be an uphill climb. But even as like we're sort of even in places where that's less of a concern, or in places where that ideology is like basically out the door at this point, um, I do believe that that overall dumbing down is something we're really going to have to fight against. We're going to have to fight for our attention spans, fight against the cell phones, and just sort of become a literate country where we can discuss a shared history, a shared culture, shared values together, that ideally are taught in schools. So I really think yeah, my biggest concern is that we're not that right now, that even if we got rid of ideology, we would still not have that shared culture and that ability to have those debates that really, again, in the democracy you rely on literate educated citizens. So that's something that really concerns me.
I was just going to comment on that for good reason. I think the 2024 NAEP scores showed 40% of students were below basic, the lowest rung on the scale for reading, and only about 30% are proficient. So it's an obvious, definite concern, and you make a good point with that. So yeah, let's go ahead and hear what gives you hope.
As part of my work, I speak with so many teachers, with so many parents across the country, across the political aisle for that matter. And I think, I don't know, I just think things are changing. And I think people are recognizing that these are real problems that need to be solved. I think people are wanting to fight back against, the dumbing down of society. They want to fight back against ideology. They want to ensure that their children are getting the good, high quality education they deserve. And I do think, I mean, I see, I've been walking around lately. I mean, the weather's nicer. That's what I mean. We had a really bitter cold winter. So the weather's finally gotten nicer in Massachusetts, and I've been taking a lot more long walks. And I've noticed so many more American flag T-shirts, so many more American flag sweaters. Like I see them more in the mall than I used to. Like I don't know. I think it is morning again in America a little bit. I do think people are starting to take more pride in being Americans again. And that's something that I do think it bodes well for schools. It bodes well for kids. And I think I really think people are wanting to be proud to be Americans again, and they want the schools to reflect that.
Oh, wow. That's very encouraging. I'm so glad that you ended with that. It's a very positive note, and patriotism is certainly something that we have seen gone by the wayside over time. So see it being rejuvenated in our country is a wonderful thing, especially if it's happening in Massachusetts. No offense.
Oh,
So
totally.
that's
No offense taken. The things I say about Massachusetts are definitely more negative than anything you could say. But no, I mean, there's a very popular women's clothing brand called Brandy Melville. It's like young, like it's like geared toward, I would say, like teenage girls, 20 somethings, and but they have this very popular American flag sweater. Like that's one of the biggest, like that's like one of their big sellers. Like you see it all over. It's modeled off like an old Ralph Lauren American flag sweater, like a vintage Ralph Lauren. So I don't know. I find that very encouraging that this like young girls brand has like a very popular American flag sweater that's been doing really well. And I see women wearing it all over. I have one myself.
that's
So
great. That is awesome. And when we get done, I'm going to ask you where to find one.
yes,
So
I'll send it.
So thank you so much, Neerja, for your time and for all the important work you're doing to restore common sense in education. But before we wrap up, where can our listeners go to read your articles and to follow your work?
Yes, you can find Independent Women's website at iwf.org. So my work is there. The report on teachers is there. I'll plug that, I obviously write about education and my op-eds and blog posts are there, but we have so many wonderful policy analyst fellows who have written also about education and about other issues as well.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much. This has been a great conversation, and I think I'd love to have you back maybe later in the year, and we'll talk about new developments and how things are progressing, especially in light of your encouragement we've heard today. So thank you everyone for listening and supporting our work. Join me again next week for another episode of Unmasking Government Schools with Sheri Few.
U.S. Parents Involved in Education is a nonprofit coalition dedicated to restoring local control of education and parental authority. By empowering parents to reclaim responsibility for their children's learning and encouraging states to move away from federal influence, U.S. PI seeks to create a culture where parents are the primary decision-makers in education and schools support families without the burden of federal mandates. If you want to start a state or regional U.S. PI chapter in your area, please visit uspi.org and complete the brief questionnaire in the chapter section.